Hello, my name is Jared,
And I'm Mostafa.
and this is our show, Writing Buddies, which we've just started right now. This is the first episode. Congratulations. So, Mustafa, I have a question for you.
What's that, Jared?
Do you ever have problem finding motivation to write?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, me too. But we both like to write a lot. It's kind of the thing we want to do. So I came up with this idea. What if we did a podcast where we have to do some writing and we can invite other people to write with us? Because maybe other people have the same problem that we have.
I'd be surprised if they didn't.
I know, right? I mean, isn't writer's block and in general just motivation kind of one of the most difficult things that any writer struggles with?
It's the popular consensus, for sure.
Yeah. So, anyways, we are also both huge fans of the website TV Tropes, I believe.
This is not an advertisement.
No, it's not. But we are huge fans of it. And so we write a little outline or some kind of a story, basically kind of almost a pitch for something using that trope. Now, one of the cool things that TV Trope has introduced in the recent years is these little pages that can go with it. And one of them is a plain with. So you can do different kinds of things. So if you take a trope and you play it straight, that's just using the trope and just going with it. But there are other ways that you can do it. Probably the most common, which I'll just use as an example, is when you subvert it. Meaning that the audience kind of sees a trope coming, but then you don't end up actually using it. There's a great quote by a game developer who you might have heard of, Hideo Kojima, who, for those of you that don't know, is most popularly known as the creator of the Metal Gear Solid franchise.
And the guy who drinks Konami tears for breakfast.
Yes. And this is a great quote to explain it from a game perspective. He said, quote, "In other words, the story does not trick the player, it is the player that tricks himself." I feel like that's a very good way to put what does it mean when you subvert a trope. So there's lots of different ways that you can play a trope. So we thought it'd be cool if one person suggests a trope for the week. The two of us who are there, we challenge the other person to one of 3 different kinds of those variations that can be used. And we'll explain more of those variations as we go along. Yep. So, without further ado, this week's trope of the week is one that I decided because it was actually the trope that kind of made me think, I wish I could write more about that and kind of think about this trope better. And so I chose the Decoy Protagonist trope, which I believe you were pretty excited when I suggested it because you also have an interest in this trope.
Oh yeah, I just love anything that has to do with subverting the expectations of what a protagonist is. That's kind of my forte.
Yeah. And so what is a decoy protagonist? Well, as you could guess, it's basically when you start a story from the perspective of a character who ends up not actually being the true protagonist who will be revealed later.
The most triumphant examples of this could be Kamina from Gurren Lagann or Eddard Stark from Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Spoilers.
It's a old trope, but it has 2 particularly common and best examples for what the trope is like. But essentially, it's basically what I said. You're introduced to a character, they appear to be the protagonist, and then through series of events, they no longer are the protagonist, usually death, and then someone else becomes the protagonist. It can be a new character. It's usually a character that's already been established. And so I challenged Mustafa for both of us to write a story or an outline of a story, an idea basically, for using this trope. Now, I gave him 3 different choices of which to choose from. I gave him exploited as a choice, which, how would you describe an exploited trope?
An exploited trope would be if you took the trope and kind of bled it for its maximum potential value intentionally in a way that's not really subtle. It's kind of like setting up a trope within the world itself.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then double subverted, which would be basically, it's like, oh, this is what's going to happen. And then, oh, no, it's not going to happen. Oh, yep, it is going to happen. Then we have reconstructed, which I was just kind of reading up on this today, so tell me if I'm wrong. But basically, for when you deconstruct a trope, that means that you're making it very realistic, essentially. It's like, well, that's not how it would work in the real world. This is what it would really be like. And then when you reconstruct it, you're like, okay, so this is what it would be like. Let's now, make it maybe a little bit more upbeat, make it closer to what the trope is actually like, but give it reasoning. Essentially, a reconstructed version of Batman is the Christopher Nolan Batman ones, where they're very highly realistic. They give motivation and all of that, but it still stays very true. Yeah, so I would almost say it's a reconstruction of it because it deconstructs then reconstructs it, almost in the same stroke.
I don't think you can reconstruct it without it first deconstructing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the whole point. It's reconstructed.
Just the same way as you can't double subvert a trope without subverting it first.
Yes, very true. So
which adds like two more usage of the trope to the story that I'm going to tell.
Yeah. So I challenged Mostafa to write it either reconstructed, exploited, or double subverted. And Mostafa did not quite understand what I was going for, and so he has written a story where the Decoy protagonist is reconstructed, exploited, and double subverted. I do not know what the story is going to be, so I'm very interested in this. So take it away. Tell us, what kind of a story is this, and then tell us the story. I'm very interested to hear this myself.
Alright, I did not understand the prompt, so I put all three usage of the tropes in this one story. So this is an outline for a potential, maybe a novel, or more like a multi-series novel, like a young adult saga or something like that.
Okay, like a Hunger Games, basically.
Kind of. Okay. So, let's take it away. Daedric Griffart is the Dawn Singer, the chosen of the eternal phoenix Agni. He is the one prophesied hero that would save the world by vanquishing the Daybreaker, the chosen of the Nishi, the Night Dragon. The Dawn Singer also happens to be the sworn protector of the kingdom of Agnaroth. So basic, typical fantasy prelude, fantasy stuff. The world, there's a chosen one, the prophecy, and he's the one who's prophesied to save the world, right?
Yep.
And here we get into a bit more complexities. So Agnaroth is actually, by the time this plot takes place, is extremely corrupt in the sense because they're so proud of their connection to the whole Daybreaker prophecy. They've seen little reason to change over the years and have regressed societally as a result. It's corrupt. There's the intense caste system which enforces on its citizens based on race, with humans being at the top of the hierarchy, and it actively enslaves anyone who's like goes against order, like criminals, protesters, or even like neighboring people. And they're also really expansionist in the sense. So Daedric has been trained his entire life by the Flame Seekers of Agnaroth, who are like a typical fantasy secret organization, to realize his true potential as a Dawn Singer. Basically, think of a Dawn Singer as a sort of a pseudo-paladin with fire powers instead of light powers.
Okay.
He has however, he has had like some problem controlling he has had some issues getting into the role of the Dawn Seeker, primarily because while he is an exceptionally skilled warrior, he's not completely in control of his magical powers because of watching his best friend burn to death when he was a child, because of a ritual the Flame Seekers were trying to perform to strengthen him. Because of that trauma, he has while he has the potential to be an extremely powerful fire mage, he hasn't really realized that role yet. So, there's room for growth, and when characters see him, they'll be like, okay, this is going in the right direction. He has the prospect for growth and the chosen one prophecy, so he might be the protagonist. So by the time the story takes place, an event called the Rising of the Poisoned Moon takes place, in which a second purplish moon rises up from the west and stays in the sky until the prophecy nears its ending. Whereas Agnaroth at this point was like facing several minor border disputes with most of its neighbors because of its whole slavery practice. The whole appearance of the poisoned moon kind of forced all of these countries to band together behind Agnaroth, because surprise, surprise, they're the country that's prophesied to save the world, because the Dawnsinger has sworn to protect Agnaroth. During this time, the Flameseekers acquire a young elvish slave called Calidor. And because elves are inherently really powerful magically, they think that assigning him to Daedric would be beneficial to him and would also help him come into his own as a powerful fire mage. Daedric, we have to mention, actually hates slavery. He hates slavery and also the social injustice with a passion, because his best friend, who got burned to death, actually happened to be a freed slave at one point when he was growing up. So he kind of sees his best friend in the boy, and he frees him, and instead of like having him be his battle slave, makes him his squire. Calidor is actually pretty skilled in the arts of magic because he was a student of magic before his family sold him into slavery to pay off a debt. And so it creates a nice dynamic between Calidor and Daedric, in which Calidor is able to teach Daedric a bit more about magic, Daedric is able to teach him a bit more about martial prowess. So battle goes on, and at first, Daedric has been led his entire life to believe that the hordes of Nishi that are coming in will be composed entirely of undead and monsters, right? So they get into battle, and in their first battle, they're like wading through and destroying all of these skeletons. Think like an epic anime-esque battle where Calidor is shooting fire into like the hordes of enemies, where Daedric is rushing in with his Zweihander and just slashing them apart. The two friends battle together into the center of their line, where they realize a shocking revelation. These aren't just mindless undead being thrown at them. There's actually a powerful core of human warriors behind these horde of undead, and they're not even mind controlled. They're willingly launching an attack into the kingdoms of Agnaroth and the surrounding nations. At this point, Daedric freezes up. He's been okay using his fire magic against undead and monsters which don't have faces. But the moment he faces human opponents, his fire magic starts faltering and he loses concentration. At this point, a single poisoned arrow hits him across the shoulder. Calidor jumps into action, pulls his mentor onto his own horse, and both of them manage to get out of the central core of the battle. And the day is won because they have managed to do enough damage. However, the poison that was laced on the arrow, it's begun to affect Daedric. Though their healers have been able to draw out most of the poison, ensuring Daedric doesn't die right away, he knows that enough of the poison remains inside of him so that he would eventually die. So here he's at the point where he starts training Calidor more extensively. So now this is an example of the trope being exploited. He knows, like, Daedric knows he's the chosen one, but he knows that because of the injury he suffered, he can't continue being the chosen one until the end of the prophecy. So he starts training Calidor extensively so that he can pass on the role to him before he dies. Right. So afterwards, the battles continue, and when it looks like Daedric and Calidor will be able to like push back the entire horde once and for all back into the west where they're coming from, a second surprise horde comes in from the north and makes a beeline straight for the capital of Agnaroth. Once they reach the capital of Agnaroth, no battle happens because most of the army is away fighting on the western front, and there is also a slave uprising is also currently occurring because the invading army managed to incite the slaves into revolting against the corrupt noblemen who try to enforce the social hierarchy on these people, and they managed to take over the capital of Agnaroth and force the nobles to barricade themselves in the central palace district. While Daedric hates the nobles and would rather that they die, his oath as the Dawn Singer means he has to intervene. And so Daedric and Calidor take branch of their army that's not tied down fighting the Western Horde and back to the capital of Agnaroth, where an intense battle ensues in which the necromancer known as Zoltan summons a gigantic undead dragon to fight Calidor and Daedric. Calidor and Daedric are at their last throes, but Daedric manages to use the last of his life energy in a single powerful magic fire spell that completely incinerates the fire dragon and kills the necromancer Zoltan with the backlash that came from it. However, this process hastens the poison spread across his body, and he soon perishes, but not before he passes on the mark of the Dawnsinger onto Calidor, naming him the successor and the one who would actually end up fulfilling the prophecy, because the blood moon still remains, the purple moon still, the poison moon still remains in the sky, which means that the chosen of Nishi has not yet been vanquished. Now, as you remember, the whole kingdom was based out of slavery and suppression of the races, and humanity, and then the top echelons of society were humans. And these nobles, while they were grateful to Daedric for saving them, they weren't necessarily receptive to the idea of elven Dawnsinger leading them into battle. Even though this elven Dawnsinger, Calidor, proves himself in the following battles as being a good successor to Daedric. So when they were almost confident that the war was going to swing in their favor, the nobles go behind Calidor's back and hire out a necromancer. With the necromancer, they break into Daedric's tomb and they resurrect him. A process that takes up a huge chunk of uses up a huge chunk of their magical reserves, mostly because they're not trying to resurrect him as a mindless zombie, but rather as him in his prime. And they succeed. And Daedric, for the most part, is the same person he was before he died. But now there's a strange issue in which they have two people alive and active right now, both with the powers of the Dawnsinger active. And while Calidor initially is not receptive to the idea of Daedric coming back because he's suspicious of his means of recovery, eventually the two reconcile and they go back to kicking ass together. And they're able to completely annihilate the hordes coming from both the west and the north. Even after that, however, the poison moon remains in the sky. So the two of them know that the prophecy isn't over and that more is yet to come. But for the moment, the two go back into reconstructing the nations. During the reconstruction of the nations, Daedric realizes that his fear of death, which he had always kind of had because of watching his best friend burn to death, had been magnified exponentially by him actually dying. And he wanted to do everything he could to make sure that didn't happen again. And even though he hated the nobles at first, he realized that if he died again, the nobles would be the only ones who would have the resource to resurrect him one more time because of how expensive the process is. And so he kind of fell into being the nobles' lapdog in a sense, even though he is still the Dawnsinger, or at least he was. The idea is not clear between the two of them at this stage in the story. However, these nobles, they're still not satisfied with having a human Dawnsinger back because Calidor is able to exert a sufficient influence, and they start plotting against him. Calidor, for his part, is growing increasingly frustrated with how him being the nation's, even despite him being the country's highest level enforcer, can barely get anything done because of obstruction from these noblemen. So he beseeches Daedric to help him out, but Daedric refuses, and this causes conflict between them. Finally, a nobleman sets out an assassination on Calidor, And while Calidor survives the assassination attempt, he is wounded and he has to escape from the capital. Watching the Dawn Singer, the chosen one, being treated like this by the noblemen causes a mass uprising of slaves and non-human citizens of Agnaroth, along with the surrounding countries, and they all rally behind Calidor. While Calidor initially is not willing to take up arms against Agnaroth, the noblemen start massacring slaves and non-humans in the capital city, forcing him to go into action and declare himself opposing an opposition to Agnaroth. Seeing this, the noblemen of Agnaroth call upon Daedric and demand that he deal with his apprentice once and for all because he is in direct defiance of Agnaroth. And as a Dawn Singer, Daedric is still sworn to protect Agnaroth. Both of them have a grand, massive battle in the capital, and at the end, both of them are arguing who or what is the champion of the dawn and who is the champion of the night. Daedric manages to overwhelm Calidor in the last battle, but Calidor once again makes one final plea to Daedric to beg him to reconsider to see what he's become. At that moment, Daedric catches a reflection of himself on Calidor's sword, and he truly pauses for a moment to consider what every action he's taken. This is at this moment Calidor seizes the opportunity to gain the upper hand, but before he could do anything, Daedric takes his sword and brings it down on himself, impaling himself and finishing himself off for a second time, merely muttering that Calidor had been right before succumbing to death once more. And at that moment, the purple moon in the sky vanishes, signaling the end of the Dawnsinger prophecy once and for all. The champion of Nishi had been vanquished. And that's the story.
Wow, I see why it took you so long to write that one.
Check on it. We
basically wrote our stories a few hours before filming this. Because we were lazy, even though I came up with this about a week ago. Both of us came up with ideas, but we didn't write them. No. I could definitely see this being a series of fantasy young adult novels.
Yeah, no, in the future I will not use 3 tropes at once to illustrate an example.
Yes. That's why it's so long this time. But I would say I feel like you pretty successfully used reconstructed, exploited, and double subverted at the same time, which... Oh, I'm just glad I didn't ask you to do subverted, because that would get awkward.
Because I had double subverted in this, I had to put subverted in it as well.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the whole point of double subverted is eventually it's
and I probably had to deconstruct it as well.
Yeah, no, I really liked this. I'll go with the one issue that I have with it before I go on to the things I really liked about it, because there's a lot more I liked about it.
Sure.
It's definitely very complicated politically. With all the slave issues and the nobles, I think it can work as a novel, because I feel like novels can usually get away with being a little bit more complicated.
Right.
But in general, some of the things I liked... Oh, first off, this kingdom that believes that they're at their height. I know exactly what you got that from. That's like Ottoman Empire inspiration.
Yes, let's go with that. I wasn't talking about America at
all. But with the whole we don't need to advance in tech. It was like Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, that's pretty much very much
Ottoman Empire meets America, basically. Yes. That's what this kingdom was. I thought that was interesting as soon as I heard that, because we've had many conversations about the Ottoman Empire, so I knew that inspiration of basically just we're at the height, we don't need any more. But then keeping that American expansionism. I thought...
The whole Manifest Destiny kind of thing.
Yeah. I thought that you had some really good development for... was it Kaladin? Calidor. Yep. You had really good development. I like he's introduced, and we see him being really noble and trying to save... the man that he is a squire to. I thought that was really good to do that. That's a really good way to develop the true protagonist. I thought your exploitation was really good. I especially like that Daedric didn't die right away. I think that made it far more interesting because I feel like most of the time using this trope, the character would die in the big battle and then hand it off. But I kind of like that he's weakened and dying, but he still has time to like impart this final wisdom to his squire. I think that the whole issue of having two Dawn singers at the same time, that's really cool. I also like that with his first death, Daedric makes a noble sacrifice, basically. Um, I
Right.
think that was a really good touch. And then you gave good reasoning for his fall from grace. Um,
Yeah, I didn't want to go the whole route of hey, he's undead now. Came back from the dead. That makes him evil. Like we just that makes him evil.
Yeah,
No.
I thought that was really good. I was kind of expecting that, oh, he was just going to turn evil. But no, it's his fear of death that causes him to become so evil. Yeah, I really liked it. I could definitely see this being a real thing. It was super interesting.
Thank you.
Like it a lot. Um, I,
Now it's
I,
time to hear yours.
yeah, I did not write nearly as much. So I was challenged to do subverted, deconstructed, or reconstructed, and I chose reconstructed for mine. And so a TV show was kind of what I was thinking. I felt like that was the best way to explore the way that I'm exploring it. It could be like an anime or a cartoon or just a regular TV show. I also went the fantasy route. So I just have a very small sort of pitch like thing. There is a troop of soldiers or of knights, and there's a leader of them, and he's very noble and kind to the people under his command. Uh, but as we go along, we see him be quite vicious in battle. But he's fighting for the good guys, and that's what really matters. And he's our main character, and
Mm-hmm.
so he always has a second in command with him. But as time goes on, this knight is becoming more and more openly vicious, and the second command becomes more fearful as he sees, this man that he respects, kind of going down this darker path. And then we
Mm-hmm.
later see that the king of this kingdom is becoming more and more vicious as well during the course of this war, and the second in command begins to openly question these tactics. And eventually, the
Right.
second in command then overthrows the lead knight and leads this troop of knights or soldiers to rebel against the brutality of this kingdom. So basically, we end up everything that was seen as good and evil are flipped around in the light of these changes, and a fight against these terrorists or maybe a different kingdom becomes a fight against an oppressive ruler, and they kind of look back, and everything that was good has now become evil in their eyes. That all the things that they thought, like, oh, these are such great things that are happening, they see them for what they really are, and they're like, oh no, this is bad. So that's kind of just the general idea of the story that I had.
Definitely has a lot of like Star Wars vibes in it, doesn't it? Was that intentional?
A little bit more of it. Originally, it was a lot more berserk. It has a little bit of that. It had more of it before, but it just kind of changed a little bit. But that was a lot of where the original inspiration came from. The whole
Gotcha.
idea of the leader of a group of soldiers and then their fall from grace.
Right,
Except in
right,
this
right.
case, not everybody dies. Spoiler for Berserk, a 30-year-old anime.
No, it's like a reverse Vanderpump.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
What happened? Reverse eclipse.
hmm
I like the realization that they're slowly coming into that everything that they thought was going to happen in the past was actually them doing bad.
Yeah,
Yeah, that like puts into question the whole are we who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and that I really like that part because it also like it toys with the idea of what a protagonist is, you know?
hmm and when I talk about the second in command doing all these things, it's definitely clear that in the course of this, he is a minor character. He's definitely becoming more. I would even say that this second in command is very much in the shadow of his leader. And it's not until he starts questioning some of these brutal actions that are taken And I would say that their group of knights are maybe the least brutal to begin with. And as he's exposed to more of the other soldiers, they're far more brutal, and the king's more brutal
Right.
and base. And then, he's kind of awakening to what's going on. And when he begins
Right.
questioning and openly questioning these tactics and decisions being made, that's kind of when he becomes his own character and starts to really take up the mantle of this series until he overthrows the knight. Now, I don't know whether he kills the knight and the knight then is gone forever, or if he just deposes the knight but doesn't kill him, and then that knight would become like a major villain. The dragon of the
Oh,
series, essentially.
the Darth Vader kind of deal.
Yeah.
I don't know up to too many. I haven't encountered the whole um like depot when they like with like the bad guy being a deposed friend. Kind of reminds me of a Wormtail, actually,
Yeah, a little bit.
in a sense.
Yeah.
Reminds me a bit of Wormtail,
Imagine if
but
Wormtail was a vicious knight.
but I like it definitely. For a TV show, I'm kind of getting some Game of Thrones vibes from it, but I feel like this specific arc would be a better version of one of the arcs that Game of Thrones is trying to push forward in one of their latter seasons. And you know what I'm talking
No,
about,
I
right?
don't, because I haven't gotten to the latter
But
seasons.
yeah, it's like a better it's like a version of a trope that they're trying to use, except they're not going about it as subtly. I feel like for this to work in a TV series, you'd have to go really slow and like kind of build it up by like giving it like by starting off with throwing off some hints, like a little tiny hint every other episode or so that something that they're doing isn't quite right, something that's a bit off.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you actually like reveal the crux of the betrayal or something like that, then you just draw upon and just reel in all those little hints you place throughout the season, and people would have a moment where they're like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah, and it should be. It's like it's got to be subtle enough that when you're seeing it out of the corner of your eye, you can just ignore it. But when you're looking
Yeah,
straight at it, you're like, nope, this is evil. This is bad. We should not be doing this. It's got
yep,
to be like that. So speaking of Game of Thrones, so now what we would like to do is discuss the trope itself. And
uh huh,
Game of Thrones is one of the two most probably well known, I would say, examples of
examples,
this trope
yes.
being used. The other, I would say, is Psycho. Because Psycho,
Psycho.
yeah, have you ever seen Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho?
That's the one with the shower scene and the stabbing,
Yes.
right?
So that's actually that scene. The woman is the main character up until that moment. And that scene doesn't take place early on. That scene's about halfway through the movie. So he actually kills
Right.
the who we believed was the protagonist halfway through the movie. So I would say that was probably the most prominent example of this trope until we get to Game of Thrones, which spoiler, Ned Stark, who's played by Sean Bean, dies.
Right.
Shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Sean Bean dies in about everything. He is quickly on his way
That's
to being the actor that has had the most deaths on screen. He's not quite there yet, but he's close. He's got like one or two actors above him, but they are really old now, so he's definitely going to pass
right.
them at his rate. So, what I want to discuss then is with these prominent examples, particularly Game of Thrones, which I feel like almost everybody's consumed now at some point or another, is this trope as relevant anymore, or does it seem cheap? It's been used now, and there's a couple of really prominent examples. So will people be like, "Oh, you're doing the Game of Thrones thing," where any show it'll get basically the what's the video game that everybody Dark Souls. So Game of
Yes.
Thrones is basically now the new Dark Souls with this trope. So it's like if the main character gets killed off, you're like, oh, it's the Game of Thrones of whatever. Like how we always say it's the Dark Souls of strategy or the Dark Souls of adventure games.
Yeah, it's even more prominent in the books because in the books, like every other story, like the story is delivered through the viewpoint characters, and all but most viewpoint characters in A Song of Ice and Fire get murdered brutally.
Yeah, a lot of them
Especially the
do.
first viewpoint character of every book. They don't make it out of the first book. I think it's a pattern.
Yeah, it is. I believe. I think he intentionally did that where the prologue character dies.
The prologue character always dies.
Yeah, which I feel like that even seems cheap. It's like expected now. It would basically be a subversion of this trope if he were to not kill them.
Yeah. I think he's already subverted in one of the latter books, because one of the latter books, it was supposed to be one book, but he split it up into two.
Yes, yeah. It's a death trope, basically. Like, even though it doesn't mean death, let's be real, death is how we usually do it.
Yep.
So yeah, I feel good about that. Should we discuss what the trope is going to be? So we decided that we're not going to do this every week, because that's not realistic for us. And it doesn't really give much time for everybody else to write. So this will be coming out about a week from today. So this is coming out about a week later. And then the week after, we will record the next episode, which the trope featured in that episode is going to be, I'll let you go ahead and reveal it, since it's your choice, Mostafa.
Okay, the trope we're going to be going with for next time is the fallen hero.
And why don't you give like a little description of that for anyone who might not have a clear idea?
Basically Satan.
Yeah. That is TV tropes. That's on it is a picture of Lucifer falling from heaven. So I have your challenge for making a story using this trope. Now, one of these three you're going to pick, not all three, although you could do a combination if you want. You did it pretty successfully this time, but that, I know, was... Man, that took a lot out of you writing that, and I can understand why.
Saying it out got, like, more tiring.
Yeah.
Like, voice is broken.
So I challenge you to either do your story using the fallen hero trait, either use it straight, so just normal, zigzagged, or enforced. So do one or more of those three.
My challenge for you is exaggerated, defied, and justified.
Defied.
Any one or more of them.
Or justified. Okay, yeah. All right. I'm up to the challenge. If you are all up to the challenge, yes, I'm talking to you, audience, then why don't you write your own stories and send them to us, and maybe we'll read them on the show if we get some really good ones. You can send them to us at buddies, since this is writing buddies at 4worldsproductions.com, and that's 4 all the way spelled out. It's not like the number 4. It is, but it's like all spelled out in letters, FOUR. So buddies at 4worldproductions.com. You can either do the fallen hero, or you can do the Decoy Protagonist, since, this is our first one, and obviously nobody had the chance to do Decoy Protagonist. I will put a link down below, give the email address that you can send it to, and I will also include a link to the TV trope pages for the fallen hero and for Decoy Protagonist, so that you can check that out and look at some of the examples that they give and some of the playing with. If you have any suggestions as well for tropes that you think that we should cover or other ideas for the show, you can put them in the comments, and please subscribe if you're on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast on. Subscribe and comment and rate depending on what options you have available, and leave any comments on tropes that you'd like us to choose from, and maybe we'll pick it. Alright, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Keep troping.